trail some 7 years ago. It was the apology tour. That America was the reason why everything was so wrong in the world. And that if America would just mind its own business, nobody would be mad at us and nobody would be waging war. And I think that that should have set the stage or put the light bulb on in our minds about what was to come during a potential at that time Obama administration. It was followed on by actions meant to fulfill campaign promises, not based on what the actual issues on the ground or conditions on the ground were. And we talk about the precipitous withdrawal from Iraq under the auspices of, well, we were unable to negotiate a status of forces agreement. Well, you really didn't try to negotiate a status of forces agreement because you didn't want a status of forces agreement because you campaigned on getting us out of Iraq. And what happened? Because there was no residual presence of U.S. military in Iraq, a vacuum was created, and as we know, a vacuum will be filled by bad people who want to do evil things. Hence the creation of ISIL. It continues today with the continued calls to close Gitmo and bring the remaining detainees to the United States. Because it's because of Gitmo that ISIL is beheading and immolating people in the Middle East. As I recall, we didn't have Gitmo back in '93 with World Trade Tower 1. We didn't have Gitmo in 1998 when the embassies in East Africa were bombed. We didn't have Gitmo in 2000 when the USS Cole was attacked. And we didn't have Gitmo in 2001 on World Trade Center 2. So to tell me that closing down Gitmo is going to make people in the Middle East like us, I think is another failure of this administration's policy. We saw a failure to respond to different things that occurred around the world. Russia's invasion of Crimea and into the Ukraine. And what did we do? We sent MREs and blankets. Okay? Not necessarily what the Ukrainians needed to defend their sovereignty. We saw a red line be drawn in the sand with Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the use of chemical weapons, which was crossed with no response. Right? And we've also seen a failure by this administration to call the enemy what it is: radical Islamic jihadism. Now, that political correctness, that strategy of political correctness, is what is setting our military up to be in decline. That's number one. Number two is the budget. I saw that Sandy talked a little bit about military budgeting 101. But remember that the whole idea behind this is that the Quadrennial Defense Review is supposed to set out a strategy, a long-term strategic vision for the military looking out 20 years. And then there's supposed to be a budget to fund that strategy. What's happened? We now get a budget, and the president says, go in there and find me a strategy based on the budget. That is not how it's meant to work. And in fact, this last go-around, before the QDR was even developed, the Secretary of Defense at the time did a strategic choices and management review, the skimmer, which basically laid it all out that really informed what the QDR was going to say, which then resulted in us finding a new strategy. Because we couldn't afford the strategy that we've had since World War II, which has always been to be able to fight two simultaneous major theater wars. Now it's win in one, delay and disrupt in two. So instead of winning in two, we now win in 1.5, based on the politicalization of our budget. And I think what really brought it home for me this year, more so than any other actions, was the use of the National Defense Authorization Act as a piece of leverage for the domestic agenda. Holding our men and women in uniform hostage in order to try to get more money for domestic spending. And that is the reason why the president vetoed the NDAA on the first pass through the White House. Now don't get me wrong, the NDAA has been vetoed before. In the 56 some odd years that we've passed an NDAA, there's been 4 prior vetoes. But every time was for something that was in the NDAA, an actual military or defense-related issue. And it came back, it was worked out, and ultimately signed into law. This is the first time that the NDAA was vetoed for something that was not in the NDAA, and for something that had nothing to do with the military or the Department of Defense. It was, we want to change the levels of spending so that we can advance our domestic agenda. We gave the president every dollar that he asked for in that NDAA. Now, we didn't necessarily give it to him in the buckets that he wanted, but he got every dollar. He got every dollar in the way that we were able to give it to him. And he vetoed that bill, holding our men and women hostage, using them as pawns to increase funding for his domestic agenda. Look, readiness, military readiness costs money. And if you skip on the money, you skip on the readiness. And I, for one, am not willing to send our young men and women off to a foreign land if they are not trained, equipped, and ready. And that means we have to invest in that readiness. In order to be successful as a military, you've got to be forward deployed. You've got to be forward deployed to be able to assure our allies, deter our adversaries, and to respond to crises. And what have we seen? A retrenchment. Bring everybody back to the States. We emptied out Europe because we didn't have to worry about the Russians anymore. For those that remember from going through your military training and having to protect the Fulda Gap, we don't have to do that anymore. We pulled everything out. What are we hearing now? Oh, we better start thinking about moving armor back in to Europe. That is the issue. Readiness costs money, and if you want to be ready, you've got to be willing to spend that money. That's the second issue when it comes to the politicalization of our military. Third issue, rules of engagement. Our men and women fight to win. We don't fight to degrade. We don't fight